even when I was there, they were starting to send kids like myself and others when we were brought in the chair
Hmm.
um, to different planets at that point. I know with Penny, the way that she's explained it is, I think that they were trying that, but they were more or less trying to see the butterfly effect, and how manipulation of time would alter
Okay.
the current reality. Um, so I'm not sure per se what all they knew at that point up to the point, but clearly they realized that they can go not only to mess with temporal time, going back in time, forward in time, but they could also start opening portals onto other planets and getting there at a faster rate. That was just the basics of the chair. I
Hmm.
know that later on, after my alter had taken over the base, I know that we delved more further into how that tech worked. Um, and some people were able to like utilize it to jump into people's bodies and stuff with their alters, things like that.
Okay, I heard Penny saying that you could do that too.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Interesting. So let's cover the ETs that were on the base. Do you remember? We can talk about the Draco later, but do you remember any other races there?
So far, like I've had images of remembering Greys being there. We had
Hmm.
Greys. We had Draco. There was other reptilians and stuff.
Hmm.
I'm not quite sure. I know that there were different kinds of alien species that showed up there, but most of the time they didn't stick around too long. It was like a trade-off for like tech for information, like tech for intelligence, or they could operate, do stuff that they normally weren't allowed to do, so they would come and show up
Yeah.
and it'd be like an intermediary situation, you know.
Okay. So the original story goes that they actually it's actually a double version there, that they actually took the seat. The chair was from the Roswell crash, which seems, well, plausible, but I guess, there were probably like 50 Roswell crashes by 1960. So, I mean, it could be any kind of crash, right? But also, the original story goes that they actually took a Syrian technology, and they were, someone like Preston was heavy on that, saying that the Syrians, and then he even described them saying they looked like us and probably maybe had bigger heads. Did you hear anything about this, where the chair came from and stuff?
They didn't really go into detail on where the chair came from. You
Right.
have to understand. So, like when I was brought in, it was like we weren't really informed about anything
Yeah.
originally. So
Mm.
basically, it was like when I was brought in, it was the same situation with everybody. You were just dragged along, ordered around, and told to do stuff until you
Hmm.
got to a certain point, and you still weren't really informed as much. Most of the time, it's just here's an order, you follow the order, you don't follow the order, here's the repercussions, and here's your orders again, follow the orders, or these repercussions are going to get worse. But they didn't really stick around and be like, okay, so this is why we're doing this. It's just like
Yeah.
when you go in the military, they're not going to sit there and explain why they're doing shit. They're just going to give you an order and you're going to follow it, you know.
Hmm.
Um, but it wasn't until like later on we found files and things like that we started learning different things. But that wasn't like a big situation for my alter at the time because there was so much going on at the base. Um, but from what I can remember, it was just like we didn't, we still did not have a grasp fully on what the chair was possibly capable of doing.
Okay.
We didn't fly any craft that I know of. Most of our missions were done trying to locate different planets, exchange technology, or resources or whatever we can get for their technology. Um, this was originally when like Preston was over us, but Preston, when I say Preston was over us, that doesn't mean that he was the director. He wasn't the director. He was just one of the programmers, but he was the one who was in charge of a lot of us.
Hmm.
Um, but that's normally what they were doing at the time when my alter was a little bit older, like around 15 and up. Uh, Most of the time when my alter was around 15, it was basically bringing, new kids were brought in. We were to do what they did to us to train them, get them all set up and squared away so like they could be sent back. You know, do their little bit of time there, sent back, and utilized later through different operations that they were pulling.
Okay.
Um,
All right. So you remember the Greys, you remember the Draco, of course, some other reptilians probably, but that was it.
yeah, I do remember meeting the Greys. One of the situations I remember was we were in a cafeteria. I think Arks talked about it a bit, but the Greys normally hung around this one individual. I know them in the here and now, and I know who their alter is and what their name is, but I'm not gonna. They're not
Mm,
public, so I'm
okay.
not gonna state anything about who they are. But I know that they followed them around. I know that they made like a hybrid Gray so that it would be easier for us to interact with them.
Okay.
Um, Normally when we would sit there and interact with that gray with the grays, they were kind of cold, um and they didn't really like, it was all telepathic from what I remember up until they had that half the half hybrid basically, and that one would speak to us normally.
Okay.
But yeah, um when it came to the grays, like I said, they were very cold. They didn't really interact too well, but it also depended on who you were. More interactions with ones that were more aligned with their genetic structure.
Okay. So what was their function there? What did they do?
I know that they did a lot of scientific stuff. I think they were probably involved in a lot of the cloning process.
Hmm.
I know that we had dogs that they had genetically altered
Okay.
that were
Wow.
on the base. Just a bunch of different things. They were involved in a lot of different things.
All right. All right. So,
There were some levels at that
okay.
time. There were some levels that we weren't allowed on, but
Okay.
they would be on those levels, if that makes sense, like areas that were off limits, things like that.
Okay. Do you remember a lab or a series of labs being there underground?
Yeah, I know that there was like, well, there was like rooms where they had like science areas. I remember that. I know that they had a separate chair that was there that would train people. Like you could sit in the chair. It was like it wasn't. It didn't look like the Matrix chair, but it basically had the same system structure where you could sit in it and it would just basically upload,
Okay.
information into your head. But like you
Right.
didn't. It didn't like plug into your head or that. It's just you sat in it and it basically utilized some kind of tech that would feed information into your head so you can learn how to do stuff.
Okay. Like speed learning. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. But no like crazy simulation like in the Matrix.
No, it wasn't like a simulation. It was more like it would just feed. Just imagine just sitting there how they were looking at say Neo, for instance, and all that information was being uploaded. Instead of being in the simulation, you were just sitting in the chair and it was just showing just
Hmm.
fast images across so that your brain could comprehend what you were seeing. You could pull it up if it was necessary in the moment,
Hmm.
but it wasn't like you were going into your mind and seeing all this stuff like how they
Yeah.
were portraying it in the
Yeah, I get
Matrix.
it. Wow. Interesting.
And
Okay.
in that room, it was a white room. Like that room was a complete white room, and the chair was a white chair. Like that's what I
Hmm.
remember. I remember being like an all white, like it was really bright.
So, who would be sent there, and why?
So like so Larry James has talked about how we would go back in time and stuff like that, and we would
Hmm.
go and we would fight in these different wars and things like that to see the changes in the outcomes and here and now, right? So what they would do to make sure that we understood how to fight in the manner that soldiers would fight back then, with the weaponry and things like that, they would basically upload that information into our brain, and
Okay.
then we would be able to utilize that when we were basically sent to go and infiltrate different
Yeah, I
areas. And
got it.
then we would also be given uniforms, like different uniforms and things like that we would dress up, if we had to grow our beards out, different things. It just depended.
Yeah, I was curious about how they did the training before those missions because those missions seem to be very complex in terms of, you had to really look the part and, you know, in order to actually influence things. It's not just, chronovising where you could go and look and then come back in a second or something. Wow, interesting. Wow, that's an interesting aspect that we actually stumble upon here. Okay, so with the races, the other reptilians that weren't Draco, do you remember them? What do you remember them doing?
It was more or less like, so you have your, like Penny's talked about, you have your Alpha Drax, then you
Hmm.
have your Warrior class Draco, and then you have, your Worker class
Worker
Draco.
class. Yeah.
So there were a few Worker class Draco, and they look like how they've been presented in some artwork, off and on, online. You had your Warrior class Draco. Those are the main ones that we had interactions with. You had like maybe one, like an Alpha Drac, maybe a couple that would come around, but it would be like you normally just didn't mess with them and kept your distance. That's what we were taught. We were taught to fear them.
Okay.
Um, but I remember like they at certain times they would have us train with them. Um, I know that when we were kids, when we were first originally there and I was younger, I remember that they would be there. So like if you tried to leave the the time bubble, which you could step out of it and go into the time period that we are in,
Hmm.
not like right now, but like back then. So the way the time bubble worked is a year here would be 3 years there.
A
So they
year
were
where?
3 years.
A year
So
in the here and now would be 3 years
yeah,
inside the bubble.
yeah, so it'd be 3 years inside the bubble. So
Okay.
3 years could pass inside the bubble, but here it would be just a year.
So there was a
That
time
makes
quotient.
sense.
It was like completely frozen. It's okay. I got it.
No, people
So,
people aged and things like
mhm,
that, but it's
okay.
like, and we had tech to stop people from dying, things like that, or aging too fast. But
Mhm.
this is just how the process worked. I don't know why that was the case. I don't know. I'm not really sure why. I know that if we affected anything outside of our time, like in this time, it wouldn't affect the time bubble that we were in. That was
Okay.
another major thing.
Right.
So it's like, so like how people would be able, some of the people would be able to leave the base, like Larry James had talked about, people would leave. The thing is when those people would leave, like Preston and Larry and all of them, like I talked about previously, when they would come back, like I said, we would have already done missions that changed the time frame and then changed that time frame back to the one that we originally were on. And they would just be none the wiser of the situation and still be like, we're going to do it anyways. So, we ran into a lot of that situation where these people would leave the base because it's like once they left, they had no recollection of what was changed. What was changed was normal to them.
Yeah. So they kind of jumped the timeline naturally, and the previous timeline, what you're saying is the previous history was kind of erased from their memory. They forgot
Yeah.
about it. So there was no Mandela effect for them, but inside the bubble, you could tell, you knew that there was another timeline, another version of history, and there is a new timeline that you changed too, right?
Yeah.
And when
And
they would go out into the world, they would basically become like everybody else, without the Mandela effect. And they would just think this is what the world has been always, right? Okay.
yeah,
Okay. um all right, so do you, like, technically, do you remember how was this time bubble generated and where was it generated from?
I'm not sure. It's like so the time bubble was there before we were. So it's like it
Hmm.
was already set up and nobody
Okay.
ever went into any detail about it. I remember, like I said, how I was talking about the interactions with one of the Draco. I tried to walk out of it, and he was like, "Don't do that. Stop me from going out of this bubble
Okay,
area.
why?
Because there was I don't know. He just basically said it was like if you walk out, you're going to be in a different time than what we're in, and that's the way it was explained to me.
Okay.
I don't know specifically why he didn't want us to walk out. Maybe it would have just been extra bullshit he would have to deal with, or whatever
Right.
the situation might have been.
Yeah, maybe it would mess with your mind and you wouldn't remember like some of the stuff that you were doing at the job, probably. The same what happened to, Preston and Larry,
Well,
probably.
I know that it didn't per se with us. I don't know why, but there was instances where we would be sent off the base. We would go out.
Hmm.
because there's this gas station that was down
Hmm.
quite a bit of ways, and like me and Ark have talked about it, but Ark more than I have. But we'd be sent down to see what kind of currency they had. And the guy it was always the same fucking guy. He might look a little different, with like maybe he'd have a beard or maybe he wouldn't, maybe he'd be clean shaved, but we would all, every time we altered something drastic and we brought our money, he would make fun of us, and be like, we don't accept monopoly money here, and it's like what Arch said that, like, that shit. I was like, fuck, dude, because I started, like, I had memories of it,
Okay.
you
Okay.
know, and
Uh,
like there was stuff flooding through when he brought
yeah,
that up.
I heard that part, and it was amazing because so my question is, would you then you brought the money from the previous timeline to this gas station, and the clerk at the gas station would say it's no good, right? Because it's not we don't accept Disneyland money, is what he said, right? Once
We
something like
don't
that. Oh,
accept
monopoly money.
monopoly money. Yeah,
Right, right,
yeah.
right. So would you then go back quickly and redo it again, get it
Yeah, so
back?
we would go back to the base and explain what had changed, what that time
Okay.
had changed, and then through that they would have a full understanding. Okay, so we did alter this. It's a drastic alteration. What's the outcome of this? And then we would go and look into that. They would send other people to go and look into it and stuff like that to see what all stuff we manipulated.
Wow.
Because it's like the butterfly effect. It's a serious thing. Like you can
Can
affect
you?
something small, and it could
Okay.
be an extreme
Cool.
change.
Okay, so the time bubble then. If you were, say, somewhere in New York at that time and you wanted to go to Montauk, would you bump into a force field or something when you went there, or what would happen?
So I can't quite remember personally. I haven't gotten memories
Hmm.
back of how we got back into the time bubble. Um, I don't know if we had to go through a portal or
Hmm.
there was some other entryway, but I do remember like you could leave it, but it was getting back into it was an issue for us, so I'm pretty sure that they had some way that we travel back and forth.
But you don't remember the entry point, how it was,
Not at
constructed.
this time, no. I
Okay.
haven't had memories of it.
Okay.
I
So
haven't
there.
really delved into it, I should say, to even
Okay.
process
So
that.
so there was no like palpable distinction between being in the bubble and outside of the bubble. It's like in a movie where someone steps into a forest and they end up in another reality, but they don't realize it, right?
Yeah, so the only alterations I remember, so like in this time, right? The windows that were at on one of the buildings were painted on,
Hmm.
you know, where in the time bubble there was an actual boarded up area where there was windows.
Hmm.
So in the time bubble there was actual windows at one point and they had just boarded it up. And because I remember a kid being pushed, basically like telekinetically pushed into it and it broke the board, like
Okay.
throwing them outside of the window.
Hmm.
Whereas in our time, it was just a wall and they just had
Oh,
painted on it.
so there were like two parallel Montauk realities then. The one that was probably for the outsiders, I guess, and
I
for those who were
do
inside the bubble.
it was like I do remember one time when Preston had asked me to go wash some of the clothes and I know that there's a washer and dryer that was at the top and somebody has it on video.
Mm.
There's a group that went there a lot, and they have it on video where you have this washer and dryer. And I remember being a kid going up to the top level and like taking the clothes there, washing the clothes. And I remember
Okay.
a soldier coming up and being like, "Who were you? Where?" You know, like started questioning because I was just some random kid that was on the base at the
Hmm.
time. And they were like, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And I was just like, "Oh, I just made up some shit, and I remember
So
like
what does that mean? You ended up in a part of the base that wasn't in the bubble. Is that what you're saying?
I think it was more or less like at some point on the top level, a lot of the people that were there didn't know that we were operating there. So it's like you can have people that are on a base that don't know what's going on or that there's an underground location.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Okay, so
But
what you're saying is it was
I remember being,
compartmentalized. Okay.
yeah, I remember being freaked out because I didn't know that anybody was going to be there. Most of the time it was
Mm.
empty,
Oh,
on the
okay.
top level once we went underground, more or less. And I just remember like freaking out and like
All
just
right.
trying to grab the stuff and go back down and be like, hey, there was this guy. I going to Nicholas and being like, hey, there was this guy at the top. He started questioning me. I don't know who he is, but he was dressed in military get up,
All right. All
you
right.
know?
So there was a bit of a mix between the compartmentalized part and the official part, I guess, the top, the surface level, right?
Yeah.
Wow, interesting. Can you say what you changed specifically to, for example, the currency to change so drastically that they couldn't accept the old currency at a gas station?
I know one of the times we altered the Roman Empire's fall.
Hmm.
So we had fought in a lot of their battles
Hmm.
on their behalf, and
Okay.
they ended up winning. And when they won, they took over. They built an actual larger empire.
Okay.
Um, I know that when that happened, that's when a lot of their currency changed, and it was like coin based in a sense. So it was kind of the same how the Roman Empire was. They had coins and stuff like that, but they took over like big time. I
Okay, so
remember that
they expanded beyond what we historically know now as the Roman Empire. Instead of falling and collapsing on itself as it was with the Germanic tribes pushing on them from the north, they actually stayed there and expanded, right? They didn't split into
yes,
like the western and the eastern. Okay, and that was the factor that actually changed what ended up to be a different currency at a gas station, but it was still the
yes.
same. But it was still the same America,
I would
was it?
say it wasn't the same America, no. Like I think the
Okay.
laws were different and stuff like that. I'm not quite sure because there was other people, like I said, that were sent on other missions to verify different things. That was more or less like we changed something, go run down here, find out if there's any alteration with it, with the currency, and then we would run back,
Wow.
Um, and that was like what I did. That's what a few other people did. But when it came to like going around and finding out the differences, governing structures and things like that, that was left up to other people.
So how do you undo this if you want to undo this?
So we would have to go back in time basically. And
Stop yourself?
well, it was like I don't recall ever seeing myself on the other side, you
Hmm.
know, but it would be like whoever was on those missions, because it wasn't always me. There was other people that were sent out to do this. There were
Okay.
other units. So, we would be sent back in time, and those people that were sent in that time were brought back, and then we would
Oh,
basically be on the opposite side,
so it's like
so
the telephone. What is it called? The anti-telephone or something that Tony
yeah.
Rodriguez is talking about. The team that was supposed to change that, you went before them, or at the time that they were there, and actually brought them back before they could change it.
Well, it'd be like, so we would infiltrate the other side's army, military.
Okay.
We would work within their structure as just foot soldiers normally.
Hmm.
Um, we were always taught not to exceed our limits because we were very well trained in combat, so we
Okay.
were always taught to keep a low profile, don't go all out, just, be basic in a sense, if that
Hmm.
makes sense,
Okay.
um
Don't be that figure in history that ends up in a textbook or something.
yeah,
Yeah,
pretty
okay.
much, like
Okay.
you didn't want to kill like 10, 15 people at once and then have a bunch of people go, oh shit, this guy, who are you, you
Hmm.
know
Hmm.
we were told to keep a low profile. But we would make sure that go back and alter it and change it either back or to a different degree or whatever. It would always be, we would always make sure that we were there so that we could, guide that alteration. So it went either the way it was supposed to or with just a bit of a twist, if that makes sense. And that was
Okay.
just that was between the Roman Empire and the Germanic, the Germans, the Germanic people at that time. We also altered, the Civil War. I remember being a part of that. There's others that remember that.
Yeah.
The original timeline I remember was that the South had won,
Hmm.
and that the North had lost. But
Okay.
when that timeline occurred, Germany was able to take America out, and that's what they wanted to change. During World War II, basically, in the original timeline,
Hmm.
America lost the war against Germany. So that's one of the major alterations they wanted to change, from what I remember. And we were able to successfully change that through changing the Civil War, because when the South won, they did win, and you could just look at history and tell that they won every battle but lost the war, which
Okay.
is just it's quite awkward, to be honest. I mean, you can even tell that it's awkward. Um, very few countries have ever won every battle and lost an entire war. But when that got altered, that allowed our country specifically to have the economic fortitude to withstand Germany during World War II. Not
Okay.
that we were the only ones that were a part of the changing that, but that just allowed us not to be destroyed easily. That was the main factor. When the South won, our economy was not good.
Okay. So I heard this story, and I'm really curious. You probably don't because you ended up there as a kid, but do you remember going into Montauk, or anyone remember going into Montauk and actually remembering the old timeline where the South had won?
I remember that was the original timeline that I came from.
Okay. So what you're saying is at Project Montauk, you had this mission where you had to ensure that the North won and that the country stayed united. And in the previous version that I heard that you're implying is that the South won and it actually became two countries, the South and the North, right?
No, from what I remember, so when the South won, they took over. It's just it wasn't
Okay.
they weren't able to keep up the economical structure for the
Right, right.
entire nation. So
Okay.
it never balanced out properly,
I
you
got it.
know.
Got it. Yeah.
Um,
And then still another question is that it's a bit of a paradox because still the history went on with the same basic features. Like, for example, you had Project Montauk in the 70s, which, even in the old timeline where the South won, that happened, right? The Montauk happened and the war
yeah.
happened. So it was pretty much the same in many ways, right?
So from what I remember, you had the original one where the South had won the Civil War, and that led to Germany taking over the country
Mm-hmm.
when they came
Oh,
when they
okay.
ended up starting World War II. And through that, the original Montauk that we had was ran by Germans.
Wow. So the Montauk that existed before the timeline change was actually a German-run project, and it still was there. So, okay, so why would you then go and alter the Civil War and World War II if it was a German project? Why would they want it changed?
So it was like you had different people, like different warring factions within Montauk that wanted control.
Okay.
That's what I remember, you know. So you had that, but it was like I said before, a lot of it was they were still trying to figure out how stuff worked. They understood butterfly effects, but they didn't understand to what extreme extent alterations would occur,
Hmm.
you know. So I remember that happening. I remember when it changed, they didn't have the control they had because they had a lot of swastikas and things that were there. But
Okay.
once that was altered, that stuff went away, and then
Oh,
it was an American military that ran it.
so what you're saying is there is a clear distinction between what happened before that change, before you actually altered history and the Civil War and World War II, right? So World
Yeah,
War II, you actually didn't go to, you didn't have to because the Civil War was the key point where this would, alter history subsequently, right? To actually make sure that America was the winner of World War II, what you're saying, right?
yeah. Well, one of them, yeah. But
Okay. Okay. And so, and the Roman Empire part, was it in any way connected with what you were trying to do also with this, or?
so it was more or less just to see what the outcomes would be.
All right.
Like
Oh,
you have to understand, like it was a time project, so it was to see what would happen if this happened or if
mm-hmm.
that happened. They
Okay.
wanted to see what the drastic alterations would be for history, if it would be more beneficial or if it would be less beneficial. The
So I,
outcome was
yeah.
to benefit the project itself and further its growth. So there's a lot where you notice you have all these different groups, like these Illuminati groups, and how they're able to be stable throughout the time.
Hmm.
You know, um, they were fed information and basically strung along through these programs.